Welcome. I'm Shelly O'Neill from the Green Velvet Couch, and I'm a therapist, a wellness coach, and certified corporate wellness specialist. On this podcast, I have the honor of talking to people who will be sharing their inspiring stories about how they've overcome obstacles to really live their life to the fullest. Hopefully, you'll leave the podcast being challenged, informed, and sharing a few laughs as we talk about hard things in a relaxing and fun manner. And as the owner of a 100-plus employee healthcare company, I know firsthand that corporate wellness is personal wellness. We're really excited to be able to bring you Briar Harvey today. She's a very esteemed professional, and we're just honored to get to know her and laugh with her and have her join us and talk about her story and what she's passionate about. She's a storyteller and a systems witch. She's an IDEA consultant. IDEA standing for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility, with a focus on neurodivergence such as ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. She also helps companies create, and I love this, implement accessibility plans. So this really helps increase employee retention at about 50%, which is huge. She's also the founder of the Neurodiversity Media Network, which is a collaborative and accessible media company. So welcome, Briar. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Shelly. Thanks for having me.
Well, welcome aboard. And I know that our listeners can go to briarharvey.com and
neurodiversitymedianetwork.com. I know it's a whole mouthful. It's
that's
delightful.
okay. That's okay. Okay, so tell us a little bit about your own wellness journey and how you got started and why you're so passionate about neurodiversity and neurodivergence.
So, my path is very long and windy. I was initially diagnosed as bipolar when I was a teenager. It was the 90s, so they put me on a lot of different drugs.
That was the 90s.
It was the 90s, so they put me on a lot of different drugs. And I was 21 years old when my oldest child was born. My mother died 6 months later, and I ended up with a pretty severe case of postpartum psychosis, which they also did not diagnose or understand well at all. So at this point in time, I'm 21. I've been in and out of inpatient treatment and facilities for a significant portion of my life. And I have this tiny scrap of a human being who was born 3 days before September 11th. So it was a really rough time for me, emotionally, physically, just in general.
Yeah, that's a lot of life events all very close
All
together.
at one
Yeah.
time.
And how old were you?
I was 21 years old.
Okay, goodness. So, yeah, very young then.
Just just barely an adult, and truly my oldest is now 22, and I'd argue less an adult than we think. It's so funny how we come back around on this stuff.
But remember thinking that like we knew so much and the world was our oyster and we had everything figured out, when looking back, I had nothing figured out?
Nothing, absolutely nothing figured out. And I didn't have a mom, so I didn't really have that barometer for what early motherhood was supposed to be like. And when my daughter was still 2 and not talking that much, and I said, I feel like there's something wrong here. I didn't have a support network available when what I got back, because I was a young mother and got back, she's happy. I'm sure she's fine. 2, she was happy, and I'm sure she's fine. At 4, she's still happy. I'm sure she's fine, even though she was not potty trained and did not have a functional vocabulary. By 6, it was she can't start, or 5, I guess, almost 6, she can't start school this way.
So that was a big difference from she's fine, she's happy, she's fine, to now she's not going to meet criteria to be able to go to school.
At the time, we lived in Phoenix, Arizona, which was still had segregated education. I don't know what's wrong with her yet, but I know that is not an acceptable solution
Mhm.
for whatever is not working here. And it took so much work for me to get her an autism diagnosis. It took me 41 years to get my own autism diagnosis. And it's taken me my entire life to understand that my brain just works a little bit differently. I learned recently that neurochemically, it's because we create all of these additional neural pathways and don't delete them. A
Interesting.
neuromajority brain will delete those unused pathways after it's learned something. An autistic brain continues to just produce and use and send electrical signals all the ways. It's
So it
why
looks like a city map then. Yeah.
it's why some of us remember things for decades and years and have absolutely flawless memories, and why some of us can remember nothing because there's so much extra information that it's impossible to process the important stuff.
Mhm. I really love how you describe that. That's a really great picture for people who do not understand neurodivergent people and how their brain works and why they can do some things and not others. When you were talking about a diagnosis, you said you were what, 41 before you could get a diagnosis?
41 before I ended up having a diagnosis, and I started pushing back against the bipolar diagnosis in my late 20s when meds were not effective for me. I did not actually start pushing for my own autism diagnosis, even with a girl child who was autistic, because I was hyperlexic and hyperverbal, and she was so verbally stunted. And even with all of the advocacy work that I had done, my awareness of what autism could be was so small. We talk about it as a spectrum because I like to talk about it like a radio band, the synthesizer, right? Equalizer. You have all of those knobs and dials and levers that go up and down. That
Mhm.
is what a neurodivergent brain looks like. Some of them are turned all the way up, some of them are turned all the way down, some of them are functional in the middle. It's all over the map, and we're all completely wired differently.
That's just such a lovely description in talking about the diagnosis and how it was hard to kind of put some things together and to get that diagnosis. And tell me about some statistics that you keep going back to about how difficult it is to get that diagnosis.
So the average diagnosis of neurodiversity takes 7 years to get. It's 10 years if you are Black or a person of color, 14 years if you happen to be trans. And this is just what mental health care looks like, right?
We so have to change that.
3% of psychiatrists who feel confident treating neurodiversity. I have a friend who's a PhD student who now regularly consults in her own classes about neurodiversity because they just don't know.
Exactly.
Here
Yeah.
she is just recently with her own autism diagnosis, educating her teachers in class. It's just wild to
Yeah.
me. And I recognize that we are learning and growing together. I also think that there are some places where the neurodivergent experience is not taken seriously or is minimized in certain ways. I think that happens a lot with executive dysfunction and the ways that we will still hear, oh, that's just an excuse. No, it's just the way my brain is wired.
But when you understand it, so many things make sense. I know before I share my experience of being ADD and how that's helped me and how that has not been a positive thing, talk about what the definition of neurodivergent really is. Like, what are some of the traits that go with that?
So, I personally define a neurodivergent brain as one where the underlying chemistry is functionally different. That includes things like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dysthymia, anything where it's permanently altered. This doesn't include things like trauma, PTSD, even arguably borderline personality disorder is probably not neurodivergence
Mhm.
because we can not cure it precisely, but we can absolutely change the way that the brain processes those stimuli or information.
Mhm.
With trauma, we absolutely can rewire how the brain takes that information in and how it outputs the stimuli.
Mhm. Yeah, and when you know more about it, I think growing up, words that we assign to people like quirky, weird, off track in their own world, really, a lot of that is because of the neurodivergent brain that they have, which
Mhm.
makes total sense. And I think as a female with ADD, it has allowed me to spin a lot of plates. And it's been helpful and probably a strength in building a business, a healthcare group, because every day is different and that's okay. And I'm used to that. The negative thing is it's not always wonderful for the people in my life. I can hyper focus, I can become consumed by what I'm doing, talk it to death, wear people out with it. And I think
Mhm.
I'm passionate when really it's part of that ADD, neurodivergent brain, because we're just processing information and details. And it's not a lot of fun, but we think it's a blast, right?
Oh, yes, it's task initiation out the wazoo. Task completion, less so.
Yes.
And in fact, we estimate that something like 70% of entrepreneurs are neurodivergent, and most of them probably are ADHD in some capacity. And that's because traditional employment does not work for neurodivergent folks.
Mhm.
It is very difficult to work a standard job with the expectations of routine and ritual and productivity if those are things that you just struggle with on a day-to-day basis.
When I'm working with companies and we're talking about retention of professionals with a very high skill level, physicians, surgeons, engineers, tech folks, what we know is with the neurodivergent mindset, you're right, that really structured day job doesn't always fit into how their brain works. So can you talk about like the accommodations that someone might need that works for them, that's just their norm, versus everybody starts at 8 o'clock and we all end at 5? Can you talk about the kind of the how to advocate for themselves and why that works and the downfall to that?
So, the first thing here is that accessibility benefits everyone. And the more that we look at ways to be accessible, the more that just becomes a part of how we structure a business. So I have a dear friend of mine who has been in my orbit listening to me talk about these things for probably close to a decade now in business.
Which says a lot that they're still in your life. That's a
That's
win.
correct.
Because sometimes people just go by the wayside. They're like, whoo, that is way too
Right.
intense for me. That is way too much energy. I'm out, right?
That's correct. And she recently hired an employee who she really liked. He's smart, he's great, he's in the warehouse. She wanted to move him into the office. He has some injuries that have caused him to have a palsy in his hands, and he can't use a mouse properly. And rather than not trying to make the role work for him, she just immediately hopped to, well, what can we do to implement accessibility here? Which in this particular case included a program called, I think, Steady Mouse, which works for folks who have trimmer
Mm-hmm.
problems to be able to navigate a page with a mouse. And then on the back end of that, she reamed out her software provider for requiring things to be checked in little tiny boxes
Okay.
instead of being able to be accessed or implemented in other ways, which will go on, I'm sure, to be greatly beneficial to other people who are potentially hard of hearing, are potentially blind. All of these little accessibility hacks that we don't think of as necessary for the majority actually do tend to be incredibly beneficial in a lot of ways for people with disabilities. And we don't think about it because it's not a problem that we have,
Mm-hmm.
which is 100% understandable, right? We don't know
Well,
what we don't know.
exactly. And I think it's important that you pointed out that accessibility helps everyone. And those seem like pretty simple things that you can do, but like with Steady Mouse, but that makes a difference in someone's being able to remain in that position. And then that affects their entire livelihood and then their family and then their community. So it certainly is something that affects all of us just by a simple way you can implement to keep someone in a position that they could be successful in. Yeah.
The issue is often, well, is it worth my bottom line to make these potential changes for one employee? And the answer is almost always yes. But specifically here, it does come back to retention. The fact that my friend made this change for this man and has structurally changed the trajectory of his career, he's never going to forget that.
Yes. Yes.
His family is never going to forget that. And they will be singing my friend praises around my friend's name for a long time, right?
Mhm.
These are the little ripple things that when we look at on an individual level have a really great capacity to change the structure of an organization's culture.
Mhm. And that's such a needed place in our work culture right now, the fact that you can do that. It's really interesting. I have a client that I had worked with that was in his early 40s and was diagnosed with autism, very high functioning, probably as a teen. And I just learned so much from him. One of the things he talked about is he would become very just enthralled with a movie or a song because it would resonate, like a vibration would actually resonate through his body. So, and he would like he would show me things, and he would be like, so what does your brain do when you see this? And I'm like, well, it sounds nice, it looks nice, but it doesn't really affect my actual physical being. And he said, well, it vibrates through my body. Or this is what I see when I look at that. And over identifying with characters in movies, which I would have said, which is quirky. And now I understand that when you have a neurodivergent brain, that makes total sense. And he kind of looked at me with this little sense of pity, and he was sorry. You can't feel that because it's great. And I thought, had I not worked closely with him, I wouldn't have thought that I was lacking in something. But now when I watch a great movie or something, I'll think about, oh, he's way out ahead of me and how he's enjoying this overall. When I'm just like, okay, well, I'm going to go get some popcorn now.
One of my favorite musical artists, Maggie Rogers, is autistic. And you should watch her perform live. There are some great clips of her on YouTube. And she dances like an autistic person dances, which is not very rhythmic to the neuro majority eye and quite beautiful to me. She's also talked about how she has synesthesia, which is seeing colors
Yes, I
and
love that.
music, and that is a common comorbidity
Mhm.
for neurodivergent folks. I learned recently that you can diagnose autism by looking at the small bones behind the eardrum. We have one that is a different shape. And when my friend went and saw the ear doctor, because we tend to have problems with our ears, her tech looked at her and said, "Oh, you're autistic." And she went, "Yes, I am, but how did you know?" The ways that we are diagnosing and discovering how our brains work are just, we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg at this point in time.
And I feel like that about the mental health field. Like, I'm really curious in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 100 years, we're probably going to look back and laugh at what we think and what we know about mental health. We just assign things to people, and it's really because we don't know how the brain does work and different things. So I think in working with companies, I think from your perspective, it must be exciting to be able to go in and educate a company about what they can do, and about how this person can not only just perform well, but really shine and have some successes that maybe no one else has in the company.
The thing about neurodivergent retention in particular is that we do tend to have astonishing workplace loyalty. Part of that is that we hate interviewing for jobs. We don't make eye contact very well. I don't really want to shake your hand. I'm probably not going to answer the personality battery questions the way you want me to answer
Mhm.
them. And when you ask if I have any questions, you might be sorry because they're not going to be the questions that you expected. And because we interview so poorly, there is an extraordinary gap of underemployment for neurodivergent people. We tend to stay in jobs where we are treated badly because our ability to go and get another one is not as clear cut as it might be for someone else. We have a tendency to take on the social managerial roles in workplaces because we frequently don't have the best of relationships with our families of origin, and
Mhm.
therefore require building something into our workplace so that we have people who we relate to. There's a lot of evidence that neurodivergent people will become pillars institutionally in terms of knowledge within a
Mhm.
company, because the ones who do remember things will remember forever. Hey, no, man, we tried that 20 years ago. It didn't work. This
Mhm.
is why it didn't work. There is currently, I learned that there is an O-ring required for the space shuttle that no one knows how to make anymore because of patents and exclusive knowledge that fell out of company knowledge. When we don't keep our knowledge keepers and our storytellers in our institutions, these are the things that we lose.
Mhm.
And in general, when we look historically speaking, and I'm not armchair diagnosing anyone, but some of history's best storytellers, entrepreneurs, innovators, those people were likely neurodiverse.
Mhm. Absolutely. And if you look through history, you can really see that with the inventors and artists, writers. It just all makes so much more sense now when you look at their personal life might have been pretty chaotic, but professionally, the things that they did and the skills and the just the abilities that they had was just astounding. And in fact, and frankly, our everyday life that all of us live here in the US is impacted greatly by neurodivergent inventors, if you think about that. So,
I mean, just today, you were likely impacted by the neurodivergence of Elon Musk. So
there you go.
you read a, I don't know what they call them now. You read an X on the website formerly known as Twitter,
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
or you read something on Facebook, because Mark Zuckerberg is also
Mhm.
diagnosed neurodivergent. Our
Interesting.
tech is based on from founders who
Mhm.
are in fact neurodiverse.
And I was reading a study the other day that said that the rates of children with autism are higher if one parent, or, and it's a lot higher if both parents are in the technical field, which I thought
Mhm.
was interesting. So,
We do know that autism diagnosis is on the rise. And
yes.
it is not just because we are recognizing the symptoms of autism better than we used to. We're also very aware that its origination and occurrence is much higher. So, the work that we've done that I've read recently in this regard seems to indicate that it happens even before fetal development. So, your predisposition to having neurodivergent children is already there. And perhaps we have reached a level where there are more of us out in the world doing things, and so we're having more children.
Okay.
Perhaps there's too much plastic in the water.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's difficult to say. And we
Hmm.
don't actually know what causes autism or other neurodivergence.
Hmm. Yeah. I'm very, very curious to find out what the research is going to be telling us in the next few years because the rates do continue to rise. And I think when you're talking about the education system and company cultures and different things, I think we have to keep that in mind that this isn't something that we're doing for a short time, that you're going to have more and more neurodivergent people in the workforce. And I think it can be a wonderful thing. I think it just can be. I think our knowledge base can really expand, but I also know it's going to look very different than traditional corporate life.
Hmm.
So, what would you say to someone who's not good at interviewing, who does look down and doesn't make great eye contact and that sort of thing? But let's say they get the job and it's a high level position, but they're going to need some accommodations. What would you suggest to them to advocate for with their new employer?
Listen, disclosure is an incredibly difficult conversation to have. And despite the fact that neurovariants are considered a disability and that it is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act, that does not mean that at will termination hasn't happened before because someone has disclosed their need for accommodation. So it's really about safety. How do you feel safe enough in a job situation to be able to ask for the things that you need? I have a workshop where I teach folks to build themselves like a personal 504 plan because that's covered under the ADA as a thing disabled people need. A 504 plan can actually go with you from early education on into the collegiate system. And the more people who have one, the easier it becomes for people to understand that this is just kind of a baseline document that describes what the needs are and how we make accommodations for them, who is responsible for making those accommodations, and how often we're going to review and document the process or the system.
Mhm. Exactly. Yeah, I think that's such a great approach to. So maybe what we need to do is when people are diagnosed, that we start advocating for them, that they do how to deal with their employer and their future employers and what that can look like for them. And I think that's a skill that's difficult for all of us when you're trying to be hired. And then at the same time that you really need to advocate for some special accommodations. And the feedback that I get from companies is always, how much is that going to cost? Is that going to be disruptive? Is it going to be seen as, quote, special treatment to someone? And what I like to say is not at all. It makes you look informed, up to date, psychologically safe. You're building a wellness culture for all people. And what you're going to get out of that is great retention, performance, and productivity, and probably a wider knowledge base than what you've had before. So you're maximizing on what someone can do by helping accommodate how they can perform best. So I think if you look at it that way, it's simple. Why wouldn't you do that?
Right. If it costs the average company, and my numbers are, I think, from 2019 here, but it was something like 3 months' salary to train each new hire. And post pandemic, we are looking at an average retention rate of 8 to 12 weeks. So our churn rate costs us more than what it does to train each new. We're spending more training new employees than we are structurally building in the accommodations that would allow people to stay.
Mhm.
And they say people don't quit a bad job, they quit a bad boss. And if a person doesn't feel like it's safe to ask for the accommodations they need, they won't stay.
Mhm.
So, being able to grant those accommodations actually just improves workplace morale overall.
Mhm. Yeah, it does, and it also saves the people that are doing the training,
Hmm.
regardless of what system that they're using or what platform. It saves them a lot of time and energy, and that's one of the hardest things for companies to measure is when you're retraining over and over and over, because that takes a toll on the person who is really overseeing that, because it's constant. So I think it's just.
Ironically, it's training where we lose the most people and where we have some of the easiest to fix things in terms of accessibility.
Mhm.
When neurodivergent folks are being trained, if they don't understand what their job description is, if they don't understand who is responsible for doing what. If they don't understand what policies and procedures are, and if there's not a clear path to who to ask for that information, they definitely will not stay. And yet, those things are structurally some of the easiest to fix in terms of training and
Mhm.
hiring.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for that information. I really appreciate and value your passion and your advocacy for the neurodivergent population, which is most of us now, quite frankly. We use that term like it's not us, but that's really what most people are, whether it's ADHD or autism or dyslexia, different things like that. Most of us can identify with that diagnosis or have a family member that is. So it affects all of us. I've seen it happen. I used to do a lot of couples counseling and different things. And everyone wants to use the word communication, but it's not just communicating, it's actually understanding what's being asked. And the request that I hear may look very different from my partner and what he hears. So, and that can cause a lot of conflict, a lot of drama, a lot of chaos. And I've seen people who really cared about each other really struggle with that. So the Band-Aid term is communication, but really it's more about inferring and understanding and being clear about the directions and the wants and the needs, because that's hard for neurodivergent people to summarize.
Say what you mean and mean what you say. And
Yes.
it's hard and it's vitally important. Some of us don't understand humor. Some of us do not understand sarcasm. And again, these are levers and switches. Sarcasm is my mother tongue. My adult child still does not understand sarcasm.
Mhm.
It's such a blow to me. But if you're not clear and direct with that one, she just thinks you're being serious.
Mhm. Yes. And in the workplace, that can become the brunt of a lot of jokes and some workplace
Hmm.
bullying, when
Hmm.
really it's just not understanding, like you said, sarcasm and different, just different ways that we use the language.
Hmm.
Well, thank you so very, very much. I appreciate you being here. I've learned a lot. I've enjoyed getting to know you. I'm certain that our listeners have just learned a ton as well. I want you to talk about, just for a moment, your social media and how people can find out more about you and your master classes that you do and the different things you do for companies, because I think you're a great resource for people, and I want to be able to give that information.
Well, thank you, Shelly. This has been a delight. I am at the Briar Harvey pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on my website is briarharvey.com, and you can find the Neurodiversity Media Network at the neurodiversitymedianetwork.com. And what we do over there is provide comprehensive, accessible education. So we start with a live masterclass and turn it into podcasts and written transcripts. We take everything and try to disseminate it in as many ways as possible because learning isn't linear. And
Mhm.
that is what we are trying to overcome over there.
Mhm.
So I would love it if you could join me there. And I am happy to consult. I work with businesses from 1 to 1 million, figuring out accessibility for both the top and for the employees. And you can find out more information about that on my website.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Shelly O'Neill from the Green Velvet Couch. If you're enjoying the show, please rate, subscribe, and review where you listen to your podcast. That helps others find the show and begin their own wellness journey. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, go live your best life.